When the new supply fails, what collapses first is not the relationship, but the internal structure holding her sense of self together. From a Jungian perspective, this is the moment when the persona, the careful, constructed mask presented to the world, loses its primary mirror. The new person was never chosen for intimacy or connection. They were chosen for reflection. Admiration, pursuit, emotional dependence, these are not luxuries. For the narcissistic psyche, they are psychological necessities. When that reflection weakens or disappears, it creates something far more unsettling than rejection. It creates disorientation. What follows is not sadness in the way most people experience it. There is no quiet grief, no reflective loss. Instead, there is a sudden exposure to the inner void, the space where a stable identity should exist but does not. Carl Jung described this as the danger of over-identifying with the persona. When the mask is fed constantly, the inner self remains undeveloped. So when external validation vanishes, the psyche has nothing solid to stand on. The result is anxiety, agitation, and an urgent need to restore balance. This is why the failure of new supply feels almost humiliating on a subconscious level. It threatens the narrative she tells herself, that she is irresistible, superior, untouchable. The collapse of the false mirror forces an uncomfortable question she cannot consciously answer. If I am not being reflected, do I still exist? That question is intolerable. And so the mind moves quickly to defend itself at this stage. She does not think about you or anyone else in relational terms. She is not missing a person. She is scrambling to stabilize an identity. The psyche goes into emergency mode, reconstructing meaning, reframing the failure, blaming the other, or romanticizing her own role. Anything is preferable to facing the emptiness directly. This is an important moment for you to understand, because it removes the illusion of personal significance. The collapse has nothing to do with your worth, your absence, or your silence. It is the sound of a fragile structure folding in on itself. And here is the deeper truth. The more completely you stepped away, the louder that collapse becomes. The real power in this stage is not confrontation, explanation, or closure. It is your absence, because when you no longer act as a mirror, you force the psyche to face itself. And few things are more transformative or more terrifying than that. What most people expect at this stage is an immediate return, a message, a call, some emotional confession that signals regret. But psychologically, that almost never happens first. When the new supply fails, turning back to you would require something far more difficult than vulnerability. It would require recognition. And recognition, for a narcissistic psyche, is dangerous. From a Jungian lens, you are not simply a former partner. You are a living archive. You carry memory, continuity, and emotional truth. You remember patterns, contradictions, moments where the mask slipped. Contacting you too soon would mean stepping into a mirror that reflects not admiration, but history. And history threatens the persona far more than rejection ever could. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow as everything the ego refuses to acknowledge about itself. You are associated with that shadow, not because you are dark or harmful, but because you saw behind the performance. Your presence activates guilt, shame, and accountability, even if she would never consciously name them that way. That is why you are avoided first, not sought. Instead, the psyche instinctively looks for safer ground. Someone new, someone distant, someone emotionally shallow, anyone who does not challenge the story she needs to believe in order to function. Returning to you too early would risk collapse, because you represent a version of herself she worked hard to escape. The one who was seen, imperfect, and emotionally exposed. This is often misinterpreted as strength or indifference. It isn't. It is psychological self-preservation. The narcissistic structure cannot tolerate environments where it is not idealized. And you, by virtue of having loved deeply and then detached, represent a mirror that no longer flatters. There is also a subtler reason. Contacting you would imply that the new supply mattered enough to fail, and admitting failure, even silently, fractures the illusion of control. So the mind postpones you. It keeps you on the periphery, not forgotten, but carefully avoided. For you, this understanding is crucial. Silence from her is not evidence that you were insignificant. It is often evidence of the opposite. You carry too much psychological weight to be approached casually. And that is why the most powerful position you can hold is stillness, when you stop chasing clarity. Explanations, or emotional resolution, you unknowingly step out of the role she needs you to play. You become unmanageable. And in the psychology of control, nothing is more unsettling than a mirror that refuses to reflect on command before she reaches outward, before a message is drafted or a name even crosses her lips. The first place she turns is inward, but not towards self-awareness. She retreats into a carefully preserved inner fantasy of who she believes herself to be. This is the most overlooked yet decisive moment in the entire sequence. When external validation collapses, the narcissistic psyche does not immediately seek repair through others. It seeks refuge in illusion. From a Jungian perspective, this inner figure is an idealized self-image that compensates for a fragile ego. Carl Jung described how, when the ego is threatened, the psyche mobilizes fantasies to protect itself from fragmentation. This is not daydreaming in a casual sense. It is an emergency psychological maneuver. In this inner world, she is still desired, still superior, still wronged rather than responsible. The failed supply is reframed as inadequate, jealous, or intimidated. The story is rewritten so that she remains central, flawless, and untouchable. This internal reconstruction happens quickly and largely unconsciously. Facts become flexible. Emotions are edited. Contradictions are smoothed over. The goal is not truth, but equilibrium. Facing reality too directly would mean confronting a painful insight that admiration was never guaranteed, that control is not permanent, and that the self she depends on may not be real. That realization feels annihilating, so fantasy steps in to stabilize the structure. This is why logic, evidence, or explanations from the outside rarely matter at this stage. You cannot compete with an internal narrative designed to preserve psychological survival. In her inner dialogue, she reassures herself that nothing was lost, that she chose to disengage, that she remains powerful. This fantasy self becomes the first source of regulation when the external world fails to cooperate. What is important for you to understand is this inward turn is not strength, confidence, or independence. It is compensation. The louder the fantasy, the more fragile the foundation beneath it. And the more completely you remove yourself from the role of emotional regulator, the more she is forced to rely on this inner fiction. This is where your silence matters most. Not as punishment, not as strategy, but as truth. When you do not intervene, explain, or re-enter the story, you allow reality to press gently but persistently against illusion. And reality always wins, not through confrontation, but through absence. The moment you stop being available as a mirror, the psyche must eventually face itself. And that encounter, whether avoided or delayed, is the beginning of real reckoning for her, and of real freedom for you. Once the inner fantasy has done its job, once the ego feels temporarily stabilized, the psyche looks outward again, but very selectively. This is where secondary validation sources enter the picture. These are not chosen for depth, intimacy, or genuine connection. They are chosen for safety. From a psychological standpoint, they offer affirmation without exposure, attention without accountability. These sources can take many forms: casual acquaintances, old admirers, social media audiences, distant contacts who require little emotional investment. The common thread is that none of them see too much. They do not ask difficult questions. They do not challenge inconsistencies. They respond to the surface, not the substance. And for a narcissistic structure recovering from collapse, that is exactly what is needed from a Jungian view. This is the ego attempting to re-anchor itself in the collective gaze rather than the inner self. Carl Jung noted that when the ego lacks inner grounding, it seeks constant confirmation from the outside world. These secondary figures function as psychological scaffolding. Each like compliment or moment of attention reinforces the illusion that nothing fundamental has been lost. What's important to understand is that this phase is not about replacing you. It is about buffering instability. These interactions are often shallow, inconsistent, and emotionally hollow, but they serve a purpose. They delay the moment of deeper reckoning. As long as admiration exists somewhere, anywhere, the psyche can avoid confronting the emptiness underneath. This is also why these connections often appear chaotic or scattered. There is no true attachment here, only regulation. One person provides attention. Another provides flirtation. Another offers sympathy. None are allowed close enough to threaten the reconstructed self-image. Control is maintained by keeping emotional distance. For you, this stage can be especially misleading. It may look like she has moved on, found happiness, or effortlessly replaced what was lost. But psychologically, this is not progression, it is maintenance. The structure is being propped up, not rebuilt. And structures that rely on external supports alone are inherently unstable. The crucial insight here is this: the more firmly you remain disengaged, the less effective these secondary sources become. They can distract, but they cannot substitute depth. They can soothe, but they cannot anchor. Eventually the noise fades, the validation loses its potency, and when it does, the psyche begins to search for something more substantial. This is when the past becomes relevant again. Not because of love, but because you once provided something none of these sources ever could: emotional grounding. And by refusing to resume that role, you shift the entire psychological balance. Your power here is not visibility, it is non-participation. Because when superficial validation runs out, the absence of depth becomes impossible to ignore. And absence, when sustained, speaks more truth than any explanation ever could. Only after the inner fantasy begins to lose its grip and secondary validation no longer produces the same effect, does your presence quietly re-emerge in her mind, not as nostalgia, not as longing, but as memory, a psychological reference point. You surface because you once provided something rare: emotional regulation through depth, not performance. From a Jungian perspective, memory is not passive. Ca. R.L. Jung understood memory as a living psychic force, especially when it is tied to unresolved emotional material. You are remembered not for what you gave materially or socially, but for how you anchored her sense of self during moments of instability. You saw behind the persona, responded to more than the mask, and for a time helped hold together what she could not stabilize alone. This is why your return to her thoughts happens late, not early. By the time she thinks of you, surface-level admiration has failed. The likes feel empty. The conversations feel repetitive. The reassurance no longer soothes. And that is when the psyche reaches backward, not forward, searching for something that once felt real, steady, and grounding. It's important to understand the nature of this recollection. It is not relational in the way healthy attachment works. She is not reflecting on mutual moments, shared growth, or emotional responsibility. Instead, the memory is functional. You are recalled as a resource, not as a person. The thought is not "I miss who we were," but "life felt more stable when you were there." This is also why the memory can feel sudden and intrusive. One moment you are absent, the next you are mentally present. That shift happens when the psyche can no longer maintain balance on substitutes alone. And yet, even now, there is hesitation. Reaching out to you risks reopening a mirror that reflects truth rather than admiration. It risks exposure. For you, this stage is deeply clarifying. It shows that your value was never in what you tolerated, fixed, or gave up. It was in the grounding you provided simply by being emotionally present and real. And once you remove that presence, it leaves an imprint that cannot be easily replaced. The crucial action here is restraint. If you re-enter too quickly, you confirm the old dynamic. If you remain grounded in your own growth, you transform the memory from a lifeline into a lesson. And that shift changes everything. Because when someone remembers you not as an option, but as a standard they can no longer reach, you have already moved beyond their reach. Psychologically, emotionally, and permanently, before any message is sent, before any attempt at reconnection is made, there is almost always a period of quiet observation. This is the final internal checkpoint. At this stage, she does not approach you directly. She studies you. Your silence, your distance, your apparent emotional independence become data points. From a psychological standpoint, this is a risk assessment, not an emotional impulse. From a Jungian lens, this moment reflects the ego testing reality before acting. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the psyche's fear of situations it cannot control or predict. You now represent exactly that. When you stop reaching out, stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, you become unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is threatening to a structure built on predictability and influence. She is not asked, "ING, do I miss this person?" She is asking, "Do I still have access?" Your behavior answers that question more clearly than words ever could. If you appear emotionally settled, focused, or simply uninterested, it sends a powerful signal. The old dynamic no longer exists. And that realization alone can halt any attempt to reconnect. Control requires responsiveness. Without it, the risk is too high. If, on the other hand, you seem available, emotional, reactive, nostalgic, or open-ended, the door appears safer to approach, not because of love or growth, but because equilibrium can potentially be restored. This is why reconnection attempts often feel oddly timed or emotionally shallow. They are probes, not bridges. For you, this stage demands awareness more than action. It is easy to misinterpret silence as confusion or internal struggle, but often it is calculation. And the most disruptive response to calculation is consistency. When your words align with your absence, when your growth is quiet but visible, you remove ambiguity. You make the test fail. This is where real closure happens, not through conversation, explanations, or emotional exchanges, but through sustained self-respect. When you no longer need to prove, defend, or clarify who you are, you step out of the psychological role assigned to you. And here is the final truth to reflect on. The moment someone has to study you from a distance to decide whether they can approach, you are no longer accessible in the way they need. That is not loss. That is evolution.